Now, where were we? Oh, at the very end of chapter 2. Missy watched as Melody's eyes grew wide and she picked her way to the back of the store. She looked like a crook in a cartoon, tiptoeing away from a crime scene, shoulders hunched, lifting her feet as high as if she were marching. Where are you going, Melody? Asked Missy. Melody ignored her. She tiptoed through the biography section. Tulip and Rusty good enough, said Harold. Meet Missy Piggle Wiggle. Missy is staying in the upside down house. Huh? Said Tulip. We thought Mrs. Piggle Wiggle would be here forever, added Rusty, speaking to his shoes. Don't you worry. Things are a bit different now, but Mrs. Pickle will be back, said Missy cheerfully. She left Wag with Harold and made her way through the store. Melody, she called, come say hi to Tulip and Rusty. Melody? She saw no one between the stacks of books. She cracked open the door to the storeroom and peeked inside. No Melody. She opened the back door and looked in the alley. Melody, she called again. She looked up and down every aisle in the store. It was when she returned to the front of the store and was talking with Harold and the Goodenough children she caught sight of Melody walking briskly along Juniper Street in the direction of her home. Aha, thought Missy, here was the problem to be solved. Missy had a growing to-do list in her head, but now she added thinking up Shina's cure for Melody to it. The cure might not be in the form of a potion. Not everyone needed a potion, but the exact right thing must be thought of to help Melody Flowers. Missy turned her attention to other matters. Does anybody know where Merryweather Court is? She asked. I need to pay a call on the free-for-alls. Those kids, said Rusty. He snorted unattractively. Should I be worried? Asked Missy. I would if I were you, was Tulip's answer. They're grabby and loud. They're wild. Honoraria is the know-it-all, said Rusty. Petulance is greedy, and Frankfurt doesn't care about anything in the whole world, said Rusty. The whole wide world. Goodness, said Missy. I'd better be on my way. Chapter 3, The Free-for-Alls. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and Mrs. Hudson Free-for-All was trying to enjoy the nice weather. She sat at the desk in her home office, breathed in the late spring smells that wafted through the open window. From her comfortable leather chair, she could see the last of the azalea blooms on the bush outside the window and hear the gentle call of a mourning dove. How anyone can appreciate nice weather while working at a desk is baffling. Why would anyone choose to sit behind her desk on a Saturday, which is a perfectly good weekend day, is even more baffling. That's exactly what Mrs. Free-for-All was doing. Also, she was recalling fondly the spring Saturdays of her youth when she and her older sister would sit on their porch and pursue quiet activities such as making clothes for their dolls or building dollhouse furniture out of toothpicks. Mrs. Free-for-All turned away from the window and back to her computer. She tapped a few keys and shuffled through a stack of papers on the desk. She was just reaching for her phone when she heard a loud crash, saw a basketball sail through the window and slam into a table, and watched splinters of glass shower onto her lovely, recently vacuumed oriental carpet. The pictures on the table tumbled off, and one landed on Muffet, the cat, who yowled and ran away from the room with a fat tail. Mrs. Free-for-All said nothing. She let out a sigh, very loud one, and walked to the window where she stood gazing speculatively into the yard. In her youth, Mrs. Free-for-All thought often of her youth. She and her sister always played peacefully. They were cooperative, everyone said so. They remembered their pleases and thank yous, and they were never loud or messy or rude. They were like little princesses. Her own children, on the other hand, her dear Honoraria and Petulance and Frankfurt, could be referred to only as ruffians. They were responsible for the basketball had just plunged through her window. They weren't going to own up to it. They had already run off. Children today, said Mrs. Free-for-All, reflected, so rarely took responsibility for their own actions. At any rate, her children rarely took responsibility for their actions. Mrs. Free-for-All saw Honoraria's bicycle lying on its side, its wheels still spinning. She saw a flower pot that had been upended. She saw a geranium now splayed on the lawn, roots and all wilting in the sun. She saw a book in a puddle, and the wrappers from a granola bar flapping about in the breeze. The yard looked though a troop of gorillas had charged through it. Mrs. Free-for-All thought of the charming and respectful children who lived next door, Della and Peony Lacarte. Della and Peony were never rude, grabby, or noisy. They were courteous and conscientious and tidy. They were forbidden to play with the Free-for-Alls. How had Lacartes managed to raise such angels? That's what Mrs. Free-for-All had wondered in the previous weekend when she had also been working at her desk, when her husband had been working at his desk in the next room, which was his office. Their children had been banging on the office doors, demanding that their parents come out and play with them, and Mrs. Free-for-All had thought, I can't get a lick of work done with all this noise and commotion. How did the Lacartes ever raise such angels? But that is not what prompted her to call Mrs. Pigglewiggle. No, she had put through her call to Mrs. Pigglewiggle week before that, after her dear children had decided to play tattoo parlor and had given another large tattoos, spider webs, fake black eyes, skulls, mustaches, and black ink that turned out to be indelible, which is a fancy word for permanent. The free for alls had been forced to send their children off to school and out into the world in general looking like the hooligans they were. After that, Della and Peony were not even permitted to walk to school with them. Mrs. Piggle had said she thought she knew the cure for such children, but that she wanted to think things through. She promised to call Mrs. Free for All back, but Mrs. Free for All hadn't heard from her. She had heard, however, from Mrs. Lockhart, who was the one that had given Mrs. Free for All Mrs. Piggle's number in the first place, and the magic lady with the potions for children had been called away, and that her great niece was coming to stay in the Upside Down house. This was the thought that was going through Mrs. Hudson Free-for-All's mind as she stood surveying the basketball and the shards of glass, that Mrs. Piggle was gone and apparently for a long time. Mrs. Piggle had been Mrs. Free-for-All's one hope for her children. She didn't know what she was supposed to do now. And then the doorbell rang. Mrs. Free-for-All closed the door to her office behind her, noting that she must go in there with the vacuum clean later and clean up the mess. She was on her way to the front of the house when she heard pounding feet and shrill cries as her children stampeded for the door. The last time she'd seen them, they were in the backyard. She wanted very much to think they had come inside to apologize for throwing the basketball through the window, but she couldn't remember the last time her children had apologized for anything. She listened to their voices. I want to answer the door. It's my turn. That was Petulance. No, it isn't. It's my turn. You had a turn this morning. That was Honoraria. I don't care what you girls say. I'm going to answer the door. That was Frankfurt. No me, no me, no me. Mrs. Free for All, who was getting a headache, couldn't even tell which of her children was yelling now. The yelling was soon accompanied by 3 thumps as children, one by one, ran into the door. Their mother hurried into the front hallway just in time to see all 3 children grab for the doorknob, wrench it around, and pull the door open with such force they fell backwards onto the floor. Goodness me. This was spoken by the woman standing at the free-for-all stoop. Mrs. Hudd from Free-for-All stepped around her children and said, yes? The woman was wearing a straw hat. Strands of wild red hair poked out from beneath it, as if nothing at all could contain it. She was wearing a strange blue outfit, and she was holding a leash, at the other end of which was a pleasant-looking dog whose tail was wagging, even though he was sitting down. Mrs. Free-for-All stared at the woman. Was she glowing? Are you the Free-for-Alls? Asked the woman. The children righted themselves. Who are you? Was their reply. You'll have to excuse them, said their mother. Yes, we are all the Free-for-Alls, and you are. I'm Missy Piggle. My great aunt left. Missy had thought she would need to offer a lengthy explanation to why she had dropped by, but Mrs. Free-for-All let out an enormous sigh of release and pulled her inside. Oh, hell, thank heaven, she exclaimed. I'm at my wit's end. The children are out of. She stopped speaking abruptly. Twins, Frankfurt, why don't you go into your rooms for a while? No, said Petulance. Why should we? Asked Frankfurt. We can eavesdrop better from down here, said Honoraria. Missy looked at the children. She raised her eyebrows. Honoraria, Frankfurt, and Petulant ran up the stairs. My, exclaimed their mother. I've never seen them do that before. She listened to the silence in the house. Extraordinary. Mrs. Free-for-All led Missy to the living room where they sat down and Wag fell asleep. The thing is, Mrs. Free-for-All began, I called your great aunt a while ago for help with the children. As you can see, they're a bit difficult. She thought fleetingly of the mustache tattoos and the yard that looked like an 8-pen. Mrs. Lockhart next door suggested that a touch of magic, a potion or tonic from your great aunt might be helpful. I don't suppose that you were cut from the same cloth, said Missy. Mrs. Free-for-All nodded and looked very relieved. The worst of it, she went on, is that we have a sitter who comes in on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons to watch the children after school, but recently she gave notice that she'll be leaving in a couple weeks. I see, said Missy, recalling the commotion that had greeted the ringing of the doorbell. Mrs. Free-for-All had the feeling that Missy truly did see, that she understood everything, and she felt grateful she wouldn't have to go into any more detail about her children's unruly behavior. A crash came from somewhere above, followed by a shout of, Give it back! Mrs. Free-for-All rubbed at her aching temples. Missy said, I'll take it. What? I'll take the job. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for the foreseeable future. The Free-for-Alls are going to be a lot of work, and Missy would need plenty of time with them. Well, that's wonderful. Now, to start, I'll need some information about the children. Oh, they're lovely, said Mrs. Free-for-All. I mean, really, they are capable of being lovely. She paused. Honoraria and Petulance are twins, identical, as you can see. They're 9. And Frankfurt is 7. My husband and I work long hours. We travel a lot too. We have offices here and at the house so we can work at home in addition to going into the city. What are the children's schedules? Asked Missy. Their schedules? What do they do on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons when I'll be here? Mrs. Free for All scrunched up her face and thought, whatever children do, I suppose. Well, what are their interests then? Oh, well, they play in the yard. Free for All said Mrs. Free for All vaguely. They ride their bicycles and, well, they're really allowed to do whatever they want. We don't have any rules here except the children must go to school. They must do that, she added brightly. Of course, murmured Missy. What about meals? Mrs. Free-for-all once again looked puzzled. There's plenty of food in the kitchen, she said at last. They know where everything is. Missy stood up abruptly. She adjusted her hat, which was listing to the side. I believe I have enough information, she said. Mrs. Free-for-all looked helplessly at her. I know my husband and I run the household a bit loosely. It's just that we spend so much time working. We don't want to be strict when the children on top of everything else. We want them to have fun. That's perfectly understandable, said Missy. Could I spend some time alone with them before I leave? I'd like to get acquainted with them. When Mrs. Free-for-all called for the twins in Frankfurt, they came barreling down the stairs just as noisily as you might imagine. Honestly, thought their mother, they sound like cattle. Yeah, said Frankfurt as he reached the bottom steps. What do you want? Asked Honoraria in petulance. Missy is going to be your new babysitter, announced their mother. This was greeted by groans so loud that Wag woke up and began to slink from the room, tail between his legs. Missy waited for the children's mother to admonish them, but Mrs. Free-for-all simply smiled indulgently at her brood. Missy clapped her hands together. Let's go outside, she said. Right now? Whined Petulance. With you? Said Frankfurt. Do we have to? Asked Honoraria. Yes, and yes, and yes, replied Missy. Frankfurt, you start the parade. I will bring up the rear. Wag and I will bring up the rear. Rear, hooted Petulance. She said rear. But Frankfurt said, I like parades, and set off through the kitchen, waving an imaginary baton. His sisters fell in place behind him. They walked sullenly along as they had weights in their shoes, until Missy cried, Use your imagination! The twins became musicians and played invisible instruments until everyone had marched into the yard and gathered around the picnic table. Now, said Missy, let me see what I have here. Have where? Right here. Missy shrugged her shoulder, then suddenly a red satchel appeared on the table, fastened with all sorts of interesting buckles and snaps and ties. Ooh, said Franklin. What's that? Where did it come from? Asked Honoraria. Can I open it? Asked Petulance. She grabbed it without waiting for an answer. Let me open it, and she did. What spilled onto the table was the biggest collection of art supplies the free-for-all children had ever seen. Tubes of glitter, bundles of markers, packages of pipe cleaners, and pom-poms and sequins, bottles of glue, stacks of paper, yarn and feathers, and stamps and ink pads. Whoa, whispered Petulance. I still don't get where it came from, said Honoraria. You weren't carrying anything. Who cares? Asked Frankfurt. He reached for the tube of blue glitter, one of the 7 tubes of glitter, and Petulance smacked his hand away. I want that one, she cried. Missy removed a small book from her purse and wrote a note to herself. What's that? Your spy notebook? Asked Honoraria. Personal business, said Missy crisply. What are we supposed to do with all this stuff? Asked Honoraria, surveying the table. My goodness, haven't you ever used your imagination? Why don't you make crowns? Today we are all royalty. Even him? Asked Frankfurt, pointing to Wag. His name is Wag, and yes, even Wag. Today we are kings and queens, and Wag is his royal dogness. Ha, explained to Honoraria, his royal dogness. Dogness isn't even a real word. You just made that up. I most certainly did. Now let's get to work. How do you make a crown? Frankfurt asked Missy. You start with gold paper, of course, said Honoraria. Everyone knows that. Petulant pulled a stack of gold paper in front of her. Hey, cried Honoraria, you can't have it all. But I need it all. Hog, said Frankfurt, grabbing the stack. Frankfurt, said Missy, when you call somebody a name, you hurt their feelings. I don't care. She is being a hog. Petulance grabbed the paper back. Mine! Suddenly, 3 pairs of hands were pulling at the papers, and just like that, the entire stack disappeared. Petulance, who had been grabbing that most freely, fell forward onto the table. Hey, who did that? Frankfurt turned accusingly to Missy. I think, said Missy, that each of you just needs 2 pieces of gold paper. 2 sheets appeared in front of each free-for-all. Wordlessly, the children set to work. Frankfurt carefully cut his papers into points. Honoraria stared at him. Finally, she explained, That's not how you do it. Whatever, that's how I do it. Work on your own crown. From the end of the table, Missy muttered, Whatever, and made another notation in her book. La, 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 hummed Petulance as she worked. I'm the queen of everything. In fact, that's going to be my real name. Petulance, queen of everything. How can you be the queen of everything? Said Honoraria. That's impossible. And I'm going to pause it there for today. Can't wait to read tomorrow.